Okay, so what if I told you there was a man who was a Muslim before Islam even began? His name was Zayd ibn Amr, and his story, well, it really makes you question everything you think you know about the origins of one of the world's great religions.
The traditional story we have is just so powerful. I mean, picture it. Zayd standing right there at the Kaaba in Mecca, supposedly shouting this out for everyone to hear. He's rejecting all the idols of his people, making a complete break from the past.
And right there, that's the mystery we're diving into today. Was Zayd a real guy, this perfect proto-Muslim? Or was his story maybe polished, expanded, or, I don't know, even invented centuries later to serve a very specific purpose? All right, first things first, let's open the case file and look at what the traditional story of Zayd ibn Amr actually says. So the biography we get from later sources is, well, it's pretty incredible. It tells us about a man in pre-Islamic Mecca who supposedly figured it all out by himself. He rejects idols, he won't eat meat sacrificed to pagan gods, and he goes around preaching pure monotheism. Figures like Zayd are called hanifs, and he's the poster child who tragically dies just 5 years before the Prophet Muhammad receives the first revelations. Talk about timing. But here's where it gets tricky for historians. There's a huge problem. And it's not about faith, it's all about the evidence. See, the sources that tell us this amazing story, they weren't written when Zayd was alive. Not even close.
Wow. Yeah, just look at this gap. Zayd dies around the year 605, but the first detailed biographies we have about him don't show up until around 750 or even later. That's a 150-year gap, a century and a half. Just think about how much a story can change in that amount of time. It's like a game of telephone, where details get shaped, polished, and maybe even perfected along the way.
And this brings us to a really important idea that historians use. It's called retrojection. The scholar Patricia Crone was a big proponent of this way of thinking. Basically, it's when you take a reality from a later time, like, say, the fully formed religion of Islam, and you project it backward onto an earlier period. It makes it seem like it was all part of a smooth, inevitable story. So this brings us to the million-dollar question. Was Zayd's story a classic case of retrojection? Was it written to prove that this idea of one God wasn't some foreign import, but that it was already in Arabia's DNA, just waiting to be woken up again? That's the core of the whole scholarly debate. All right, let's put on our detective hats and follow the paper trail, starting with some really controversial poetry. So one of the key pieces of evidence people point to is poetry from another one of these supposed monotheists, a guy named Umayyah ibn Abi al-Salt. And his poems they sound a lot like the Quran. Supporters say, see, this proves these ideas were already floating around. But most modern scholars are pretty skeptical. The poems seem almost too perfect, a little too convenient. The thinking is that they were probably forged or at least heavily edited later on to act as the perfect prequel to Islam. Okay, so the paper trail is kind of messy. Let's turn away from the books and look at something a bit more solid. The silent stones of archaeology. And this is where the problem gets really, really clear. The literary sources, the books written centuries later, are just filled with these stories of seekers, these hanifs. But the archaeological sources, the stuff from the actual time period, complete silence. We have thousands of inscriptions dedicated to all sorts of different gods, and even the name Allah shows up. But we have found zero, not one, single inscription from that era that mentions the word hanif. And look, this is a huge deal. For a top historian like Robert Hoyland, this isn't just a minor gap in the evidence. He calls it a deafening silence. I mean, if there was a whole movement of these hanifs out there, you'd expect to find something, right? A piece of graffiti, a carving on a rock, anything. But there's nothing. So what we have is a really powerful story on one hand and a totally silent historical record on the other. So which is it? History or story? Let's try to weigh the possibilities. Okay, so where does that leave us with Zayd? Fact or fiction? Well, as with most things in history, the real answer is, you guessed it, it's complicated. Here's how most scholars tend to look at it these days. First, was there some big, organized Hanif movement? Probably not. The lack of any physical evidence makes that really hard to argue. But second, could there have been scattered individuals, people like Zayd, who are just fed up with the old gods? That's totally plausible. The whole region at that time was a whirlwind of different religious ideas.
And finally, was the story of Zayd later built up and shaped into a powerful symbol? Absolutely. He becomes the perfect role model, the ideal pre-Islamic believer. And this is why it all matters so much. Whether Zayd's story is 100% historically accurate or not, it serves this incredibly important purpose. It grounds the beginning of Islam in local Arabian soil. It makes the case that pure monotheism wasn't something borrowed from Jews or Christians nearby, but that it was a homegrown, authentic tradition just waiting to be restored.
And that leaves us with a final thought, one that goes way beyond this one story. How much of our history is about what actually happened versus the stories we need to believe happened to help us make sense of who we are today? And honestly, wrestling with that question, that's what studying history is all about.